to reduce having those convoys, and they're cutting the money so that our military will be more dependent on the fossil fuel that comes from unstable countries in various parts of the world. Mr. President, how much time do I have left?
6.5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. President, China is racing ahead with respect to these kinds of investments. And the fact is that they're sending their students to the United States for degrees in math, science, engineering, but the House is cutting Pell Grants so that there's a 15% cut below the maximum level, which would affect over 100,000 students in college, making it less affordable, less accessible for low and moderate income students. That's not a budget that helps our economy. It does nothing with dealing with the deficit and jobs. They tie the hands of the Consumer Product Commission, the Product Safety Commission, so they can't launch a database for consumer products. So I guess you don't need to know, if you're an average American, you don't need to know if the products you buy are safe or if they're going to harm you. That doesn't matter anymore, even though it has nothing to do with really dealing with the budget problem. They reduce federal funds from being spent for Planned Parenthood, for doctors and nurses, to conduct 1 million life-saving screenings for cervical cancer, more than 830,000 breast cancer exams. I guess it's much more important that millionaires, people earning more than $1 million a year, get their tax cut than that 830,000 women have breast cancer screenings. I mean, this value system is something that I think is absolutely essential for us to examine. The House cuts almost $2 billion from the clean water and drinking water state funds that allow us to capitalize on low-interest loans and no-interest loans so that we can build and refurbish clean water systems. All across our country, we have communities that are under court orders to clean up the water for our citizens. And the House is cutting the ability of those communities to be able to provide for that because they don't have the tax base, most of them, to be able to do it on their own. The House bill prohibits the EPA. That discussion took place, and I'll skip over it. But it has nothing to do with deficit reduction. It just prohibits the EPA from enforcing clean air laws. After the American people decided in 1970 they wanted clean air, and people's lives have been improved because we provided it. So we're going to go backwards there. The House bill, I mentioned the ARPA-E cuts. The House bill cuts $780 million below the energy efficiency and renewable energy, which is going to cut critical programs that advance our job base. I just met yesterday with the CEO of a major solar company. They're going to create a huge number of jobs in the southwest of our country. They are the largest facilities are going to be in Arizona and California. But by cutting the loan guarantee program, we're going to lose 1,200 jobs just on the California project, and that doesn't include the $500 million of equipment from U.S. suppliers in 9 states, including Arizona, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Colorado, and Kansas. That's a loss of jobs in every single one of those states. Mr. President, the House bill reduces funding for the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, which is going to reduce the research and hurt job creation. It slashes funding for the National Science Foundation by more than $300 million. That's 1,800 fewer research and education grants. And just earlier this month, 300 of America's leading economists, including Alan Blinder and Laura Tyson, sent an open letter to President Obama and members of Congress concerning these cuts, and they said it is short-sighted to make cuts that eliminate necessary investments in our human capital, our infrastructure, and the next generation of scientific and technological advances. They said Republican planned cuts threaten our economy's long-term economic competitiveness and the strength of our current economic recovery. The letter goes on to say that we need to look and sustain the critical investments in the productive capacity of the United States. Mr. President, you're a farmer. There isn't a farmer in the country who doesn't know you don't eat your seed corn. But that's what we're doing here. We're eating our seed corn. We are stripping away America's already challenged ability to compete against China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, countless countries that are indicating far more seriousness than we are about their desire to build out and build a future. We have a train that runs from Washington to New York called the Acela. It can go 150 miles an hour, but, Mr. President, it only goes 150 miles an hour for 18 miles of that trip between here and New York. Why? Because if it goes too fast under the tunnel in Baltimore, the tunnel may cave in. Because if it goes too fast over the bridges at the Chesapeake, they may fall down. You go to China, you ride on a train that goes 200 miles an hour, and the water doesn't even move in a glass. 300 miles an hour in the maglev train from Shanghai Airport to downtown Shanghai. Go to Abu Dhabi, go to Dubai, go to Paris, go to any major airport in America, and you'll find an airport that outshines the airports of the United States, and you'll find public transit systems that outshine the public transit systems of the United States. Because once again, we're living off what our parents and our grandparents built, because we're not willing to pay for anything, which is why revenue in the United States is at a 60-year low. Mr. President, we need to be smart about where we're going here. The GDP of our country is measured by our total expenditures of consumption of the American people. It's measured by our investments. It's measured by government spending and investment, and by our exports minus our imports. That's the GDP. That's how you measure GDP. How can these folks sit here and say, if you cut the government spending, you're not going to cut the GDP, which is what every major economic analysis has said. So yes, we have to cut waste. Yes, we have to cut some spending. Yes, we have to be responsible. But let's be responsible in a responsible way by looking at the overall budget and the places that we can reduce at a tempo, Mr. President, that doesn't do injury to our ability to be able to invest in America's future, create the jobs for the future, but nevertheless send the right message to the marketplace and to the American people. We've done that before. We saw the longest expansion in America's history. Staring us in the face, Mr. President, is the largest economic opportunity of a lifetime. The energy marketplace is a $6 trillion market with 6 billion potential users today, rising to about 9 billion over the next 30 years. But we're not engaged in that. 2 years ago, China produced 5% of the world's solar panels. Today, they produce 60%. And the United States doesn't have one company in the top 10 companies of the world's solar panel producers. What are we doing? The biggest transformational market staring the United States in the face is the energy market, and we should be here putting an energy policy in place, an education policy in place, an infrastructure investment policy in place, and a research policy for technology and medical that soars, that takes America into the future, creates the jobs we need for the next generations, reduces the deficit in responsible ways, not in this unbelievable, reckless, meat axe, hatchet budget that is being presented to us by the House of Representatives. We need to find the common ground. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the full text be placed in the record as if delivered in full.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair.
Mr. President,
The Senator from Vermont.
I ask unanimous consent to all remaining morning business time be yielded back.
Without objection. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-23, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 6, S-23, a bill to amend Title 35 United States Code to provide for patent reform.
Mr. President, before I begin, I note that I applaud the senior senator from Massachusetts for her statements about how we should be spending money on innovation. She's spending money on energy and so many other areas. I worry that we oftentimes ignore some of the basic causes of the huge deficits here. We went into an unnecessary war in Iraq, a war Some said we had to do because of weapons of mass destruction, when we had many of our intelligence agencies were telling us there were no weapons of mass destruction. But worse than that, for the first time in America's history, we went into a war where we decided to borrow the money from the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis and others, rather than pay for it. So we did a massive tax cut bill, blew through the enormous budget surplus the Clinton administration left, and then we borrowed the money for a war which is still going on 10 years later, and it's cost thousands of American lives, tens of thousands of other lives, people terribly crippled and injured who will be suffering for the rest of their lives in this country, and spent $1 trillion, all on an unnecessary war, and one for which we borrowed the money, putting ourselves in, not increasing the security of the United States, but decreasing the security of the United States by borrowing money for war. First time in our nation's history. In Afghanistan, went in for the right reason to capture Osama bin Laden. When we had him cornered, our CIA agents and our special forces were pulled out of Afghanistan to go into the war in Iraq. And we're still in Afghanistan. Another $1 trillion, which we also borrowed. So now we have these deficits that we have to pay off, deficits caused by wars that did nothing to improve our security, did nothing to create innovation, did nothing to minimize the transportation difficulties we have in our country, did nothing to decrease our reliance on foreign oil and other energy, did nothing to allow us to innovate where we could become not only energy independent ourselves, but export to the rest of the world the products we had created. The day will come when historians and our children and our grandchildren will look and say, what were you thinking of? What were you thinking of? Because what that has done, aside from wasting the surpluses that we had, what it has done is created problems perhaps for generations to come. And the United States, the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth, at least for the moment, has suffered grievously. Now, there are some things that we can do right. American ingenuity and innovation have been a cornerstone of the American economy from the time Thomas Jefferson examined the first patent to today. The founders recognized the importance of promoting innovation. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to inventors the exclusive right to their respective discoveries. Unlike things that have been created by statute, the idea of patents is actually enshrined in our Constitution. And the discoveries made by American inventors and research institutions, commercialized by American companies, and protected and promoted by American patent laws have made our system the envy of the world. The Senate has before it the American Invents Act. This will keep America in its long-standing position at the pinnacle of innovation. I was glad to see the overwhelming bipartisan vote in favor of ending debate, invoking cloture that was cast yesterday. One of the rare instances ever in Vermont where snow has impeded us and made it impossible to get back. We did have in some parts of Vermont over 30 inches of snow. I think about 28 inches, 29 inches in the greater Burlington area in 28 hours. It actually closed down the airport. In a rare circumstance, schools closed in Vermont. Now, That snow finally ended late yesterday afternoon. Everything's open there today, naturally. There are 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot snowbanks on the side of the road where it's all been plowed, but the roads are bare, people are going back to work and school, and I'm delighted to be back here, Mr. President, to what I hope will bring about the successful conclusion and vote on our legislation. It is, after all, the product of 8 hearings over the last 3 Congresses, hundreds of meetings, dozens of briefings, and I again thank Secretary Locke and PTO Director Kapos for their involvement, their wise counsel, and their support. And I'm very pleased, I see my distinguished colleague from Iowa on the floor is helping getting the cloture vote passed by an overwhelming majority last night. You know, I introduced the Patent Reform Act of 2009. That is a precursor to the American Invents Act before us today, along with Senator Hatch and others. And our bill was the subject of consideration amendments over several thoughtful sessions of markups in the Senate Judiciary Committee in March and April of 2009. At that time, Senator Kyle asked that I convene a meeting with the Director of the Patent and Trademark Office to discuss whether there are further changes the office needs in the legislation to improve the office's efficiency. And we held those discussions. We held countless other meetings and briefings with interested parties in an effort to improve the legislation, again on a bipartisan basis. People like Bruce Cohen in my office, Aaron Cooper, Ed Pagano, and others had meeting after meeting after meeting, just as predecessors of theirs had. In short, we spent a whole lot of time making sure this was done right. And we did it in a bipartisan manner. After all, bolstering the American economic recovery and strengthening our efforts in global competition shouldn't be a matter of partisanship or political advantage. So that's where we are today. Process of discussions and debates and deliberation. Resolved in legislation is going to be a much-needed boon to our economy. It's also a model for our legislative process. Shows what you can do when you set aside partisan rhetoric and instead negotiate and collaborate together in good faith. The last time Congress significantly updated the patent system was more than half a century ago. In the intervening decades, our economy, of course, has changed dramatically. A patent system developed for our 1952 economy, before the Internet, before cell phones, before computers, before photocopiers, even before the IBM Selectric typewriter, for those old enough to remember that, needs to be reconsidered in light of 21st century realities, while staying true to the consistent constitutional imperative of encouraging innovation and invention. Our patent laws that were the envy of the world in the 20th century desperately need to be updated if we're going to compete effectively and win the future. China and the European Union are improving their patent laws. We can't remain complacent. If we're going to win the global competition by out-innovating the rest of the world, we need a patent system that works in the 21st century. And listen to the voices we heard in this debate. They represent virtually all sectors of our economy, all interests in the patent system, and they have not been uniform as expected. But they know that the legislative process is one of compromise. That way during the 6 years we've been at work on this bill. 3 major areas of concern emerged from the discussion. The American Invents Act addresses each one of them. First, there is significant concern about delays in the patent application process. The Patent and Trademark Office, PTO, currently has a backlog of more than 700,000 unexamined patent applications. Now, there are several reasons for this, not the least of which is the PTO is overwhelmed with patent applications. It doesn't have the resources necessary to get through that backlog. The director of PTO often says that the next great invention that's going to drive our economic recovery may be waiting on a shelf, waiting to be granted. Well, our act authorizes the PTO to set its fees and ensures that PTO have access to those fees. We want them to work through the backlog. We want them to be current. And I want to commend Austin Goolsbee, the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. His whiteboard presentation this week on the importance of patent reform showed that we needed to help America win the global competition and create jobs. So we should be doing all we can to help the PTO director. You know, it makes no sense. It takes 2 years for an inventor to get an initial ruling on his or her patent application, and another year or more to receive a patent. This during a time when technology changes sometimes by the hour, say nothing by the year, the 2-year, the 3-year. The New York Times reporter Edward Wyatt notes that delays and inefficiencies are more than a nuisance for inventors. Patent delays cost jobs. They slow the economy. They threaten the ability of American companies to compete with foreign businesses. And then there's a concern about the quality of patents that we've issued. Just as high-quality patents are the key to innovation, low-quality patents are a drag on the economy. They provide monopoly rents over products or processes that were not inventive. So when Congress last overhauled the patent system in 1952, more than half a century ago, PTO received approximately 60,000 patent applications. 2009, it received more than 480,000. So the America Patents Act will improve the quality of patents. Legislation makes a common sense change that third parties can assist the PTO examiners by providing relevant information. The bill also created a new post-grant review process for patents that were recently issued to improve the quality of patents in the system, as recommended by the National Academy of Sciences. And the third concern is that as business competition has gone global, and patent applicants are increasingly filing applications in the United States and other countries for protection of their inventions, these are inventors from around the world, our system puts our own American investors and businesses at a disadvantage. Now, the filings system in the United States differs from that in other patent issuing jurisdictions that have first inventor to file systems. That difference causes confusion and inefficiencies. Inefficiencies exist both in the application process and determining what counts as prior art. I ask consent to place in the record this time an editorial from today's New York Times, which calls the transition to first inventor to file simpler and cheaper and says it should benefit the little guy.
Without objection.
So we have bipartisan legislation before us to help everyone from startups and small businesses to our largest cutting-edge companies. It's going to create jobs. It's going to improve products. And before my voice gives out, I say now's the time to create jobs at home. Now's the time for Congress to act on patent reform. We can actually accomplish something here and not add a cent to the deficit. Mr. President, I asked consent to my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask that the proceedings of the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to add my voice to the debate that has been going on in this chamber about spending proposals and the how we get through the balance of this current fiscal year and ensure that we don't end up with the government shutdown and some of the repercussions that would come about from that. Mr. President, I'm blessed to represent a state that has not only a disproportionate share of federal employees, but also has a large number of private sector employees that rely upon predictability from the government. And unfortunately, with these kind of lurching from 2-week extensions, we are not providing that predictability. Mr. President, as you know, I strongly believe that this is a moment in time for this body and our colleagues in the House and the President and others to come together regarding the question of how we no longer simply look at our debt and deficit on a piecemeal basis, but we actually take on this issue in a comprehensive basis, as so many both elected officials and financial officials continue to make. Matter of fact, Mr. President, I came earlier today from testimony that was provided by former Senator Alan Simpson and former Presidential Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles about the consequences of our failure to act if we don't get our comprehensive deficit and debt under control. This is a problem that's not going to get any easier. Every day we fail to act, we add $4 billion to our national debt. Unfortunately, some of the proposals are coming particularly from the House at this point. The House budget plan does nothing significant to address our long-term deficit and debt issues. Mr. President, I travel around Virginia a lot. Yesterday I was down with our colleague from Georgia, Senator Chambliss, where we met with literally hundreds of business leaders from across central Virginia. And their message was clear. No more games, no more showmanship, get something done. And that something they want done is a comprehensive approach to our nation's fiscal challenges. That will mean, yes, cutting down on spending. That will mean as well making our tax code more efficient so American business can grow and compete. It will also mean at the same time recognizing if part of that tax reform effort adds revenues, because trying to deal with this problem on simply cutting or simply taxing will not be sufficient. Instead, the focus that the folks across Virginia and I imagine across Montana are saying as well, this is a moment in time we've got to put everything on the table, and we've got to ensure that we actually provide a long-term solution. One of the things that has been most frustrating as I've more listened to this current debate about CRs and what we're going to do for the balance of this fiscal year is that the debate has focused almost entirely the spending cuts proposed from the House on domestic discretionary spending. The $60+ billion that the House has celebrated all comes from that one narrow slice of the pie. Domestic discretionary spending accounts for less than 12% of our federal spend. You cannot solve the $1.5 trillion current year deficit or the over $14 trillion long-term debt without going beyond that 12% of our budget. And what is particularly, I think, should be particularly challenging to our colleagues is the fact that, again, every day we fail to act, we are seeing not only our debt grow, but we are seeing the amount of taxpayer dollars that we have to spend to pay off current interest rates, current interest payments continue to rise. Matter of fact, it's expected that at some point over the next 3 or 4 years, the amount that we pay out of every dollar collected simply on interest will exceed the 12% of our current spending on domestic discretionary spending. So all of this current fight about these current cuts that are being proposed all will be subsumed in interest payments that we will all have to make as Americans. Dollars that, quite candidly, don't go to build another school, to make another investment, to build another road, dollars that are not recycled in this country, but increasingly are owned by folks abroad, increasingly by our bankers in Asia, and a disproportionate number from China. So, Mr. President, when we have the chance to vote on H.R. 1 this afternoon, I will be voting no. I will be voting no because I think this narrow focus on domestic discretionary spending only for cuts will not get us to the point of where we need to be in terms of long-term deficit reduction. And let me just again point out where I think the House proposal is so short-sighted. One of the things that Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson said today was there is no silver bullet in this challenge we've got in front of us. It is going to take significant spending cuts. It is going to take looking at the revenue side through the aspects of tax reform. But those two things, revenues and spending alone, still won't get us out of this problem. We've got to have a third leg of that triangle, and that third leg of the triangle is a growing economy. Well, how do we grow an economy in a place where America is, while still is the world's leading economy, does not drive the economy the way it did even 20 years ago? We saw 20 years ago where the world would have to wait on America to get its financial act together. The world is not waiting right now. China, India, Brazil, countries abroad are moving ahead. So if we're going to remain competitive, we've got to continue to invest smartly. Well, the President has said we've got to make sure that we educate, we've got to invest in our infrastructure, and we've got to be able to out-innovate. And that means targeted research and development. Unfortunately, the House proposal, which not only focuses on domestic discretionary to the exclusion of other areas of spending, but also focuses these cuts on the remaining 6 to 7 months of our fiscal year, takes a disproportionate whack out of these key areas where we must maintain certain levels of investment if we're going to grow the economy to make sure that the other cuts and the other revenue raises won't have to be as draconian. Let me give you a couple of examples. I know the presiding officer comes from an energy-rich state. He also realizes that we've got to diversify our energy mix in this country and no longer be dependent upon foreign oil. One of the things that those of us who have hallowed the benefits of the Internet over the last 20-plus years are quick to point out that the Internet came about because of initial government investment through ARPA. That led to the development of the networks that created the Internet that has spawned tremendous economic growth in this country. I believe, and I think many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle believe, that we need a similar investment in the energy field. Well, there was created the ARPA-E program at the Department of Energy. If we move forward with the House budget proposal, that will cut $1 billion out of the kind of basic research we need to make sure that we've got a full portfolio of domestic energy sources. Renewable energy sources, I, for one, believe that they also has to include conservation, nuclear, increased continued domestic oil and gas, coal. All these have to be part of the mix. But we have to do them in a smarter and cleaner way. And to right now, at this point, cut $1 billion out of that kind of basic next-generation research and development, the same kind of research and development that in the IT field created the Internet, would be short-sighted, and I think in most business folks' minds. Another area, America, we have to get our health care costs under control. Well, part of getting our health care costs under control means continuing to unlock innovation. Perhaps one of the greatest growth fields of the next 20 years, and something I know that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee has been working on in terms of his patent reform, is making sure that in the life sciences area, America continues to lead in terms of innovation. Well, where does that innovation come from in terms of government dollars being leveraged 4, 5, and 6 times? That comes from investments in NIH. Unfortunately, the House budget proposal cuts $1.3 billion from NIH funding. Well, if you're in stage 2 or stage 3 of the next generation cancer development drug, to have those kind of trials cut back, to have that kind of basic research cut back, not only in terms of American economic growth, but the personal toll it could take on folks who are desperately waiting for solutions to the disease, I believe is, again, not a good policy choice at this moment. As we move forward as well, we've got to make sure that we out-educate our competitors. No one believes that America's future is going to be based on low-wage labor. It's going to be based on well-educated, innovative, and well-trained workforce. I think we've seen, and one of the areas that this President has not gotten appropriate credit for, is the fact that he has advanced forward dramatic education reform within his proposals. Unfortunately, the House bill will cut $5 billion from the Department of Education and over $1 billion from the Head Start program. When we're trying to look at our kids competing against kids from India and China, does it really make sense at this point, if we're going to grow our economy, to slash education programs if we're going to have that well-trained workforce? So, Mr. President, I do believe that the House proposal is short-sighted. I believe it doesn't do anything to really take on the structural deficit that our country is facing. I will continue to work, I know, with the presiding officer, and I think a growing number of members from both sides of the aisle, and our suggestion is to let's go ahead and take the good work that was put forward by the Presidential Debt and Deficit Commission as at least a starting point and put in place as consequences if we don't act. But we will not solve this issue, which is, I believe, the issue of the day. As Chairman Mike Mullen said, the #1 national security issue for this country, to get our deficit and debt under control, unless we can broaden this debate from the 12% of domestic discretionary to include, yes, defense spending, entitlement spending, tax reform, trying to make sure that everything's on the table. The House approach does not do that. The House approach is short-sighted. The House approach will not allow us to grow our economy in the way we need. I will be voting against that proposal when it comes to the floor, but I look forward to working again with all my colleagues to make sure that we get a true, comprehensive deficit and debt reduction plan that this Congress can vote on and put in action. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Well, general speeches opened the day in the Senate today. We heard remarks mostly about 2011 federal spending, H.R. 1, as negotiations continue behind the scenes in those two competing proposals to fund the federal government for the rest of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. No votes as of yet are scheduled for those proposals. We are also expecting more work on the patent and trademark law overhaul legislation that they've been debating over several weeks. You heard Senator Leahy speak a little bit about that. This legislation calling for some of the most sweeping changes to patent law in decades. Senators are set to take a break for their weekly party lunches in just a couple of minutes. That's set for 12:30, and then they'll be back at about 2:15 for more legislative work. Live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise today.
We are in a quorum call.
I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate your patience and your forbearance. I wanted to rise today to speak on the legislation that's currently before the Senate, the America Invents Act of 2011, and I want to applaud the work of Judiciary Committee Chairman Leahy and Ranking Member Grassley for working so hard to bring this complex bipartisan legislation to the Senate floor. As we work to rebuild our economy, get Americans back to work, and win the global economic race, we should all appreciate this effort to spur innovation and create jobs. Patent reform is an important issue for Colorado's economy and, of course, our national economy. High-tech innovators represent over 12,000 jobs in Colorado, and they are an important part of our economic recovery. In addition, Colorado has a vibrant biotech, clean energy, and aerospace set of industries. And that's why I believe that getting patent reform right and achieving consensus on provisions like inter-partes reexamination is so important. Inter-partes reexam is a proceeding at the Patent Office that allows for the validity of a patent to be challenged in an administrative proceeding. These proceedings are intended to serve as a less expensive alternative to courtroom litigation and provide additional access to the expertise of the Patent Office on questions of patentability. Inter partes reexam is often the preferred method of examination because a panel of experts are more likely to reach the correct decision on a technical question compared to a jury composed of lay people. Mr. President, the inter partes process is not frequently used today because of procedural restrictions in the existing law. Rather than expanding the opportunities to use the inter partes reexamination process, the America Invents Act before us today imposes standards that are more restrictive than current law and are not supported by top high-tech innovators. We need a patent reform bill that is fair to America's innovative technology companies and all users of the patent system. Now, by failing to provide any relief from the huge burden that abusive patent lawsuits impose on technology companies and instead reducing the protections in current law, I fear that this legislation will force these companies to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on frivolous lawsuits. These are dollars that would otherwise be used to employ engineers, produce and market new goods and services, and help Colorado and America win the global economic race. As this legislation moves to the House, we must work to achieve consensus on inter partes reexamination. While I do not believe that we have the right balance quite yet, I do believe that this bill is a good faith effort to improve our patent system, and I'm going to support moving it forward because we cannot let job-creating patents to languish any longer. Mr. President, as we all know, the Patent Office has an enormous backlog. It's truly enormous. It's 700,000 applications in addition to 500,000 new applications every year. Each of these pending applications will create, on average, 3 to 10 jobs, but while these applications collect dust in America, other countries are getting a head start on technologies that can revolutionize the way we live. So I'm very pleased that the America Invents Act will address the funding challenges faced by the Patent Office. This legislation will allow the Director of the Patent Office to set fees as necessary, but it will also ensure that those fees stay at the Patent Office, all without any additional cost to taxpayers. This legislation will allow the Director to finally clear the backlog and create needed jobs through innovation. It is my hope that the funding provisions in the America Invents Act stay in this legislation as it moves to the House. I'm also pleased that this legislation includes an amendment I co-sponsored with Senator Bennett to establish additional satellite patent offices around the country. It is no secret that we believe that Colorado is well situated to house a regional satellite patent office because of the combination of our rich and diverse innovative economy, our strong research universities, and the fact that Colorado is a great place to live. And I'm confident that Colorado will be competitive in the process of selecting these new satellite patent offices. So in the end, I believe that the America Invents Act goes a long way to help unleash America's innovative spirit, but we need to make sure that we don't make changes that could have unintended consequences for some of our most innovative companies. Let's get patent reform right, let's move it forward, and let's continue working to make our patent system fair, efficient, and supportive of innovators as we seek to compete in the global economy. Mr. President, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interest in your own state of Montana. And, Mr. President, with that, I'll yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
A break now for the U.S. Senate.